Hey guys, so in this video we're going to be talking about repetition and more specifically loops. So the first type of loop that we're going to be talking about is something called a while loop. And before we get started, let's start off with a little story. So let's say we're cooking some kind of sauce for I don't know, some kind of pizza or something, or some kind of dinner. And this sauce that we're making it from scratch. And let's say we're following a recipe, and this recipe might tell me that, while there's still lumps in my sauce, keep stirring the sauce around while you're cooking it, right? And so that idea of while there are still lumps, keep stirring it can actually be transformed into a Python-like kind of instruction. So I'm actually going to create a new file here. And what we're going to say is, we're going to say, for example, and this is kind of Python, but it's going to give me an error if I run this. So basically we can say while there are lumps, we can say give sauce a stir. So the idea here is basically while there's still lumps in my sauce, give the sauce a stir, right? And then eventually this is going to be false because there are no more lumps left. Now the idea here is that we repeatedly check for lumps. And so if we find any, stir the sauce to try to get rid of them, right? Okay. Now we can kind of illustrate this process, just like with if statements, by using a flowchart. So let's actually look here. So here we have a flowchart about what's kind of happening here. So the idea here is that, and I'll bring up the code as well. And I'll make this much smaller so we can have it kind of like bite-sized. So the idea is that when we come in here, there might be a few lines up here, some code up here. We're going to enter in this loop, this while loop, kind of like an if statement. We're going to evaluate it. So we're going to evaluate whether or not there are lumps. And whether or not this is true or false, we're going to run a certain command. So let's say this is true. So there are lumps. Well, if there are lumps, then what we want to do is execute the statement. And what does the statement mean? Well, the statement in this case is give sauce a stir. Okay, once we've executed that statement, notice that not only does it, wrap back around, but it wrap backs around the evaluate or the expression section. So after we give the sauce a stir, it's going to once again check for lumps. So it's going to go back here, and it's going to check for a lump, right? Check for a lump. If this is true, then evaluate the statement, so give sauce a stir. And then what it's going to do is going to come back around and evaluate the statement once more. If there are lumps, then give the sauce a stir. Now, what happens if it's false? Well, if this evaluates to false, what it's going to do is it's going to continue on to the next part of the code. So for example, it's just going to say, pour sauce onto bowl or onto plate, for example. We might do something like that. So this is if it's false, but if it's true, it'll just continuously do this over and over again. So what happens, or how can we kind of generalize this into a more specific program? Well, let's actually look at how we might do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just put this here, and we're just going to make this a little bigger. Okay, so how do we kind of generalize this into Python here? Well, what we can do is we can say while some Boolean expression, we can run some kind of statement. So the execution of the while statement is kind of similar to the if statement, if you guys remember the if statement, where we just had an if, right? And then we had to evaluate a Boolean expression. But this time, all it's doing is it's kind of infinitely running these ifs, and eventually when the if is false, it's going to break it out of it. So if the Boolean expression is true, run the statement. But instead of if, we're going to say while the Boolean statement is true, then run the statement over and over again. So it's just going to continuously run this program or this statement over while it is still true, right? Okay. So that's kind of the flowchart and the idea behind the while loop. But how can we actually code this up into an example that we can actually see works? Well, let's actually, I'll provide you guys an example right now. So we're going to create actually, we already have a file here. So what we're going to do is first, let's take in a value as input. So let's take in a value. And we're actually going to make it an integer. So we're going to have to cast the input into an int. And we're going to say, give an integer, but say that give a 0 to stop. Give 0 to stop. Okay. So it's going to prompt us for an integer. And what we're going to do is we're going to say while, right? So while the value that I inputted doesn't equal to 0, then what I want to do is first, I'm going to print out the value and I don't know, maybe say square the value as well. So we might say value. So remember to cast it to a string, put the space, and then we're going to have to cast the string of the exponent. So value squared, let's say. So now we have the value and the value squared. And now what I want to do is I want to ask the user to input the next value. So we're going to say value is equal to int input. And here we're going to say give the next integer. And once again, give 0 to stop. Okay. So let's make this a little bigger so we can fit the whole code here. Whoops. Okay. So once we take in the value now, what we're going to do is we're going to just say, that's pretty much it, right? So now let's actually run through this code together. So what is actually happening here? And we might actually run this first. So I'm going to run the module, but make sure to save it. And I'm going to save it under my users here. This is while loops. Oh, save it here. Okay, so it says give an integer, give 0 to stop. So let's say, for example, I wanted to give the value 2. Well, once again, in our program, what we programmed it to do was to print this value itself, a space, and then the value squared. So I'm expecting this to give me 2 space 4. Cool. Now what if I did 4? I would expect 4 space 16. If I did 8, I get 864. 9, I get 981. Now what if I wanted to stop this? Well, all I have to do is write 0. And then there we go, it stops the program there. So let's actually go through the code line by line and see how or what is actually happening here. So for the first line, what we're doing is we're declaring a variable and taking it in as input. So this part should be familiar with you guys, and if you're not familiar, then I would advise to watch the previous videos. The next thing we have is a while loop. And how a while loop once again works is there's a condition inside of it, and there's also a statement in the body of it. Now, while the statement is true, what it's going to do is it's continuously going to run the statement inside of its body. So you can see while the value doesn't equal to 0, so if we look at exactly what we took in as input, we can see that, and let me move this over, we can see that we took in the value of 2. Now with the value of 2, does that value equal to 0? Or is that value not equal to 0? Well, since it's true, what it's going to do is it's going to execute whatever is inside the body, right? This value right here, value does not equal to 0, that is true. So what's going to happen is it's going to print the value and the value squared, and then it's going to ask you to retake in the value of our value variable. So once again, it's going to take in the next value, so 4 here. And what it's going to do is it's going to compare it to this value or to this condition. So what's going to happen is 4 not equal to 0. Well, yes, that's true. So what it's going to do is execute the body, and it's going to retake in some input. The next value we put in was 8. And for this value, it's not equal to 0 either. So that's true. Run the body, and then take an input once again. And remember that because we're updating this value, it knows which value we're talking about, right? So we're going to say, while the value does not equal to 0, well, in this case, since it's 8, that's true. Run the body and take an input. Taking an input, we get 9. And we can see here that 9 does not equal to 0. So that's true. Print out the value and the value squared. And then we're just going to take in the input again. Now, what happens when we take in the input and it's equal to 0? Well, since the value of value does not equal to 0, since value is equal to 0, this would be false. And what's going to happen is it's going to run the program outside of it. So actually, if we said here, program was stopped, we can just print that out and we can see once again what happens. So if we run this and we put in the same values, so we said 2, right? 2, 4, 4, 4, 16, 8, 8, 64, 9, 81. And then finally for 0, we can see if this value is false, it's just going to do whatever, it's just going to not execute the body and get it over with, right? It's going to go to whatever is the next part of the program. So you can see program was stopped. Okay, so that was a pretty simple example of how we might be able to use this kind of while loop in Python. Okay, so let's try another one. Okay, so let's say, for example, we wanted a program to read the marks obtained for a student on an exam and find the average mark. So we want to say, read in the marks of a student or of students and find the average. All right, so how can we program this in? Well, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to say, for example, the total marks that we have. So in order to find the average of all the students, what we need to do is we need to take in mark 1 plus mark 2 plus mark 3 and so on. Sorry, mark 3 and so on. And what we need to do is divide by the total number of marks. Total number of marks. So we need all these things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I'm going to first make a variable to store the total marks, which is the top value here. So I'm going to say total marks is equal to 0. And what I'm going to do is also make another variable, which is number of marks, which is equal to 0 so far. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable called next mark, right? Next mark. And what this is going to be equal to is the integer value of the mark of the current mark. So it's going to go mark 1, mark 2, mark 3, and so on. So we're going to first cast the input to an int. And what we're going to say is we're going to say submit mark, submit marks, value less than 0 to stop. So I'm going to stop out of my loop, or stop inputting the number of marks or all these individual marks when the value they input is less than 0. So we're going to say while next mark is greater than or equal to 0, because if it's less than 0, this value will be false. What we're going to do is we're going to say total marks plus equals, so that increases the value. That not only adds the value to it, it increases the value itself of total marks by the next mark. And what we're going to do is we're going to say number of marks plus equals 1. So it increases by 1. Then what we're going to do is we're going to ask for the next mark. So we're going to say next mark is equal to the int of the input. And we're going to say, what is the next mark? Please enter the next mark or whatever, right? All right, so now we can see here that it works, that it's going to work perfectly fine. So we're basically saying store the total marks, so store all of this, store the number of marks so that we can divide it by the total number of marks. And what we're going to do is we're going to take an initial input value, so just like this. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, while that value is greater than or equal to 0, continuously add the marks to the total marks and increase the number of marks by 1. Then take in the next input. Okay. And you can kind of see why we couldn't have put that up here, right? The reason we couldn't have put that up here and then left this out, right? We can't just do something like this, is because this next mark value doesn't actually exist yet. And so we need to take an initial input, then we can actually go next. Okay. So then from there, what we're going to do is we need to have a little condition first. So we're going to say if the number of marks is greater than 0, then we can actually calculate the average. The reason we need to check if it's greater than 0 is because if we divide it by 0, it's going to give us an error. So we're going to say the average is going to be the total marks, so total marks, divided by the number of marks. And what we can do is simply print out average for all students is, and then we're going to cast it to a string, the average. Okay, great. So let's actually run this program here. So we're going to run module. And let's say the first mark that we had was an 81. Then it's going to ask us for the next mark. Let's say it was a 95. The next mark was a 78, a 96. Let's say we had a pretty bad student, 63 or something. 75, we had a 83, for example. And then finally, to stop submitting marks, all we need to do is input a number less than 0. So a number less than 0 could be -1, -2, -3. It could be -1 million. So if we input that, we can see that the average for all students is 81.57. Okay, so there you go. You can see that it is pretty useful for calculating some averages for any application that you make in the future. Okay, so a few things about this kind of while loop is that 2 things. The minimum number of times a while loop could run is 0 times. That makes sense because if this value, right, if we already put in a negative value, it's not going to run even once. So if we put in -1, nothing is going to run, right? The while loop is not going to run because this value here is false. This only runs when the value is true. So we're going to say min times a while loop runs is 0. And what about the maximum number of times? Well, the maximum number of times that it can run is infinite, right? The reason we can run it infinite times is because a valid while loop actually looks something like this, while true. And this kind of while loop will actually run infinite number of times unless you use a keyword called break. And this break statement actually breaks out of the while loop. Okay, so it'll stop the program there. Or sorry, it'll break out of the body of whatever it's in. Now the minimum number of times, so I'll say here it's infinite. While the minimum number of times can be simply done like so. while false. And this is valid. The reason this is valid is because we can simply just run it 0 times, and it's going to evaluate to false and not run whatever in the body. Okay, so basically in this video, you learned about while loops and how to use them to our advantage when we want to do something multiple times instead of, copy pasting in the input multiple times. Because for this, we could have obviously just, done something like this. We might have just said, for example, take all of this. Oh, whoops. We might have taken all of this, copied it. So we could highlight this, copy. And what we could have done is we could have just said, paste this, paste this, paste this, right? But we don't know how many times this is going to happen. So can we, do this infinite number of times? Well, that's almost impossible, right? Because what if I had 1,000,000 marks? Are you going to copy paste this 1,000,000 times? Well, not really, right? So that's not a really good way to use this kind of program. Instead, we can run something multiple times or how many times we want using while loops. All right, so that's pretty much while loops.